Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The basement of the Blackwood residence on 3rd Street had remained sealed for nearly 3 decades when city officials finally broke through the rusted iron door on March 15, 1891. What they discovered beneath the modest Victorian home would forever alter the understanding of human depravity in Harrisburg, New Pennsylvania, and challenge the very notion of civilized society in the closing years of the 19th century. The investigation began not through any deliberate inquiry, but through the mundane necessity of municipal expansion. The city had acquired the property following the death of its last known owner, one Cornelius Blackwood, whose estate had languished in legal limbo since his mysterious disappearance in 1863. Plans called for the demolition of the structure to make way for a new telegraph office, a symbol of progress that would connect Harrisburg more efficiently to the rapidly expanding industrial networks of the East. Inspector Thomas Caldwell, a methodical man whose 20-year career with the city had prepared him for the usual discoveries of urban decay, rotted foundations, forgotten storage, the occasional vagrant's shelter, approached the basement door with routine expectation. The iron barrier, however, proved unusually resistant to standard tools. Multiple locks, each of different manufacture and apparent age, secured the entrance with an almost deliberate redundancy that suggested something far more significant than mere storage lay beyond. The first indication of the basement's true nature came not through sight, but through an odor that escaped when the final lock yielded to the inspector's crowbar. It was not the expected mustiness of long-sealed spaces, nor the sweet decay of organic matter, but something far more complex, a mixture of human habitation, fear, and what the inspector would later describe in his official report as the scent of prolonged suffering. When lantern light first penetrated the darkness below, Caldwell's initial observation focused on the basement's unusual construction. Unlike typical residential foundations of the period, this space had been deliberately expanded and reinforced. Stone walls bore evidence of careful masonry work, while the ceiling showed signs of sound-dampening modifications, thick layers of what appeared to be felt and horsehair plaster applied with meticulous attention to coverage. The floor plan revealed a series of interconnected chambers, each roughly 10 feet square, connected by narrow corridors that seemed designed to prevent easy navigation in darkness. Iron rings had been embedded in the walls at regular intervals, their surfaces worn smooth by what could only have been years of use. Chains of varying lengths hung from these fixtures, their metal darkened by time and substances that defied immediate identification. Dr. Margaret Henley, the city's first female physician and one of the few medical professionals willing to examine the scene, noted in her preliminary assessment that the basement showed clear evidence of long-term human occupancy. Personal effects, fragments of clothing, eating utensils, and what appeared to be makeshift bedding lay scattered throughout the chambers in patterns that suggested both organization and desperation. The most disturbing discovery, however, came in the form of extensive documentation found within a locked cabinet in the basement's central chamber. Cornelius Blackwood had maintained detailed records of what he termed his theatrical endeavors, written in a precise hand that betrayed no awareness of moral transgression. These papers, numbering in the hundreds of pages, described a systematic approach to what he called the cultivation of authentic human expression through controlled adversity. Blackwood's journals revealed a man of apparent education and refinement who had somehow convinced himself that his activities served a higher artistic purpose. References to performances and audiences appeared throughout the documentation, along with detailed observations about human behavior under extreme duress. The clinical tone of these writings, combined with their meticulous organization, suggested a mind that had rationalized unspeakable acts through the lens of intellectual pursuit. City officials immediately sealed the basement and restricted access to only essential personnel. The discovery's implications extended far beyond the immediate horror of the physical evidence. Questions arose about how such activities could have continued undetected for years in a residential neighborhood, and what had ultimately become of those who had been held in the basement's chambers. The investigation that followed would consume months of official attention and generate documentation that, even today, remains partially sealed in the Pennsylvania State Archives, deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The examination of Cornelius Blackwood's extensive records began 3 days after the initial discovery, conducted in the sterile environment of the Harrisburg City Hall's Document Preservation Room. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a specialist in historical manuscripts from the University of Pennsylvania, had been summoned to assess the material's authenticity and provide insight into their contents. What he encountered challenged not only his professional expertise, but his fundamental understanding of human nature. The documents were organized with disturbing precision. Blackwood had maintained separate ledgers for different aspects of his activities: financial records, correspondence, performance schedules, and what he termed subject profiles. Each category was meticulously indexed and cross-referenced, suggesting a mind that approached its dark work with the same methodical attention typically reserved for legitimate business enterprises. The financial records proved particularly revealing. Blackwood had maintained detailed accounts of expenses related to his basement operations, including payments for construction materials, food supplies, and what he euphemistically termed acquisition costs. These latter entries, dating from 1858 through early 1863, suggested a systematic approach to procuring individuals for his purposes. The amounts varied significantly, ranging from modest sums that might represent payments to accomplices to larger expenditures that implied more complex arrangements. Dr. Fairfax noted that Blackwood's handwriting remained remarkably consistent throughout the 5-year period covered by the documents. There was no evidence of mental deterioration or increasing agitation that might be expected from someone engaged in such activities. Instead, the script maintained the careful, educated penmanship of a man who viewed his work as both important and legitimate. The correspondence files contained letters to and from individuals across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Many of these communications were written in a coded language that initially obscured their true meaning. References to theatrical talent, extended engagements, and private performances appeared frequently, suggesting a network of individuals who shared Blackwood's interests or, at minimum, were willing to facilitate his activities for financial compensation. One particularly disturbing series of letters, dated throughout 1861, detailed negotiations for what Blackwood called specialty acquisitions. The correspondence partner, identified only as H.M. from Philadelphia, appeared to serve as an intermediary for locating individuals who met specific criteria. These criteria, when decoded through context and cross-reference with other documents, revealed Blackwood's preference for performers, actors, musicians, and other entertainers who possessed what he termed natural expressiveness. The performance schedules documented a regular pattern of activity that spanned nearly 5 years. Blackwood had maintained a calendar noting presentation dates, typically occurring twice monthly and coinciding with what appeared to be visits from outside observers. Guest lists accompanying these schedules included names that Dr. Fairfax recognized as belonging to prominent citizens of Harrisburg and surrounding communities, though verification of their actual participation would prove impossible given the coded nature of the records. Most unsettling were the subject profiles, individual files that Blackwood had compiled for each person held in his basement chambers. These documents contain detailed physical descriptions, background information, and ongoing observations about behavior and psychological state. The clinical tone of these profiles suggested that Blackwood viewed his captives not as human beings, but as specimens for study and manipulation. Each profile included a photograph taken in what appeared to be the basement setting. The images, captured with the precision possible only through extended exposure times, showed individuals in various states of distress and exhaustion. The technical quality of the photography was remarkable for the period, suggesting that Blackwood possessed considerable skill with the relatively new medium or had access to professional assistance. The profiles also contained detailed notes about what Blackwood termed performance evolution. He documented changes in behavior, emotional responses, and physical condition over time, creating a disturbing record of human deterioration under sustained duress. These observations were accompanied by sketches and diagrams that illustrated various restraint methods and environmental modifications designed to enhance what he called authentic expression. Dr. Fairfax discovered that Blackwood had maintained extensive correspondence with individuals he identified as fellow researchers in what he termed the science of human extremity. These letters, exchanged with parties in Boston, New York, and as far away as London, suggested the existence of a broader community of individuals engaged in similar activities. The academic tone of these communications, filled with references to psychological theory and artistic philosophy, revealed how Blackwood had constructed an intellectual framework to justify his actions. The final category of documents consisted of what Blackwood called his theoretical writings, essays and treatises in which he attempted to articulate the philosophical underpinnings of his work. These papers, numbering over 200 pages, presented a twisted interpretation of artistic truth and human authenticity that portrayed suffering as a pathway to genuine expression. The sophistication of the arguments, combined with references to legitimate philosophical and artistic works, demonstrated the extent to which an educated mind could rationalize unconscionable behavior. As Dr. Fairfax completed his initial assessment, the scope of Blackwood's activities became increasingly clear. This was not the work of a simple criminal, but rather a systematic enterprise conducted by an individual who had convinced himself, and apparently others, that his actions served a higher purpose. The documentation revealed a network of complicity that extended far beyond the basement on 3rd Street, raising questions about how many others might have been involved in or aware of Blackwood's activities. The implications of these discoveries would soon extend the investigation far beyond Harrisburg's city limits. The investigation expanded beyond Harrisburg's borders when Dr. Fairfax's analysis revealed the true scope of Blackwood's correspondence network. Letters bearing postmarks from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, and New York suggested a coordinated system of individuals engaged in what Blackwood's documents euphemistically termed experimental theater. Federal authorities, initially reluctant to involve themselves in what appeared to be a local matter, reconsidered their position when presented with evidence of interstate communication regarding criminal activities. Detective Samuel Morrison of the Pennsylvania State Police assumed coordination of the expanded investigation on March 28, 1891. Morrison, whose previous experience included tracking confidence schemes across state lines, brought a methodical approach to unraveling what appeared to be a sophisticated network of criminal collaboration. His first priority involved verifying the authenticity of the addresses and individuals referenced in Blackwood's correspondence. The Philadelphia connection proved most immediately fruitful. The mysterious H.M., who had served as Blackwood's primary contact, was identified as Harold Millbrook, a theatrical agent who maintained offices near the city's theater district. When authorities arrived at Millbrook's establishment on April 2nd, they discovered that the business had been abandoned approximately 1 month earlier, with no forwarding address provided to the building's landlord. Millbrook's former office, however, yielded significant evidence. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found records that mirrored Blackwood's organizational system. Client files contained photographs and detailed descriptions of performers, along with notations about their suitability for what Millbrook termed specialized engagements. Financial records indicated substantial payments received from sources in multiple states, suggesting that Blackwood represented only one client in a much larger enterprise. The Boston correspondence led authorities to Dr. Reginald Ashworth, a physician who had been dismissed from Harvard Medical School in 1856 under circumstances that university officials declined to discuss publicly. Ashworth's letters to Blackwood revealed a shared interest in what he called the physiological manifestations of extreme emotional states. When confronted by Massachusetts authorities, Ashworth claimed that his communications with Blackwood were purely theoretical in nature, part of his research into the relationship between psychological distress and physical health. However, a search of Ashworth's residence uncovered a basement laboratory equipped with restraint devices and photographic equipment, similar to that found in Blackwood's basement. More disturbing were Ashworth's medical journals, which documented experiments conducted on individuals he claimed were willing participants in his research. The clinical descriptions of these procedures, combined with the obvious distress evident in accompanying photographs, suggested that Ashworth's definition of willing participation differed significantly from conventional understanding. The New York connection proved most elusive. Letters addressed to the Meridian Society at a Manhattan address led investigators to a prestigious gentlemen's club whose membership included prominent businessmen, physicians, and academics. Club officials vehemently denied any knowledge of activities related to Blackwood's enterprise, claiming that the society was devoted entirely to philosophical discussion and cultural advancement. Yet Detective Morrison's investigation revealed that several club members had made unexplained trips to Pennsylvania during the period covered by Blackwood's performance schedules. Hotel records in Harrisburg showed registrations by individuals whose names appeared on the Meridian Society's membership rolls, with dates that corresponded precisely to Blackwood's documented presentation events. The London correspondence presented unique challenges for American investigators. Letters from one Professor Edmund Blackthorne of the Royal Institute suggested that Blackwood's activities were part of an international study of what Blackthorne termed authentic human expression under controlled adversity. The academic language and apparent institutional affiliation lent a veneer of legitimacy to communications that, when examined closely, clearly referenced the systematic torture and exploitation of human beings. British authorities, when contacted through diplomatic channels, reported that no Professor Edmund Blackthorne was affiliated with any recognized institution in London. However, they acknowledged that several individuals matching descriptions provided by American investigators had been observed in academic circles, presenting papers on psychological research that had raised concerns among legitimate scholars. The pattern that emerged from these investigations revealed a network of individuals who had created an elaborate intellectual framework to justify their criminal activities. By positioning their actions as scientific research or artistic exploration, they had managed to operate with relative impunity while maintaining their standing in respectable society. The sophistication of their organizational structure and the apparent international scope of their collaboration suggested years of careful planning and coordination. Most troubling was the evidence that this network had developed methods for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects for their experiments. The correspondence revealed a systematic approach to targeting individuals whose disappearances would attract minimal attention: traveling performers, immigrants, and others who existed on society's margins. The efficiency of this system suggested that Blackwood's basement had housed far more than 17 individuals over the years of its operation. As the investigation continued to expand, authorities began to realize that the discovery in Harrisburg represented only a small portion of a much larger and more disturbing enterprise. The search for individuals who might have witnessed or survived Blackwood's activities began with an examination of missing persons reports filed in Pennsylvania and surrounding states between 1858 and 1863. Detective Morrison's team discovered a disturbing pattern: dozens of performers, traveling entertainers, and itinerant workers had vanished during this period. Their disappearances noted but never thoroughly investigated due to the transient nature of their occupations. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a seamstress residing on 4th Street, approached authorities on April 10th after reading newspaper accounts of the basement discovery. Her testimony, initially dismissed as the ramblings of an elderly woman seeking attention, proved to contain details that only someone with direct knowledge of Blackwood's activities could have known. Mrs. Hartwell revealed that she had worked as a domestic servant in the Blackwood household from 1859 to 1861. Her duties had been strictly limited to the upper floors of the residence, with explicit instructions never to venture into the basement. Blackwood had explained this restriction by claiming that he conducted sensitive photographic work below, requiring absolute darkness and silence for proper development of his plates. Despite these restrictions, Mrs. Hartwell had occasionally heard sounds from beneath the house that troubled her deeply. Muffled voices, sometimes raised in what appeared to be distress, would emanate from the basement during evening hours. When she had inquired about these sounds, Blackwood had explained that he was conducting rehearsals with local theatrical groups, preparing performances that required intense emotional commitment from the participants. Mrs. Hartwell's account became more disturbing when she described the visitors who frequented the Blackwood residence during her employment. Well-dressed gentlemen would arrive in unmarked carriages, typically on weekend evenings, and would be escorted directly to the basement entrance. These gatherings would continue for several hours, after which the visitors would depart with what Mrs. Hartwell described as expressions of profound satisfaction. The former servant also recalled deliveries that had puzzled her at the time. Food supplies would arrive in quantities far exceeding what the household required, along with medical supplies and what appeared to be clothing in various sizes. Most memorably, she had witnessed the delivery of heavy chains and metal fixtures, which Blackwood had claimed were props for his photographic work. Mrs. Hartwell's testimony led investigators to other former employees of the Blackwood household. James Fletcher, who had served as groundskeeper from 1860 to 1862, provided additional details about the property's unusual features. He described modifications to the basement's exterior ventilation that seemed designed to prevent sound from escaping, as well as the installation of multiple locks on the basement door that Blackwood had personally supervised. Fletcher also recalled incidents that had seemed innocuous at the time, but took on sinister significance in light of recent discoveries. He had occasionally been instructed to prepare lime and other materials for what Blackwood termed sanitation purposes. These materials would be delivered to the basement entrance and would disappear overnight, with no explanation provided for their use. The most significant witness, however, emerged from an entirely unexpected source: Dr. Margaret Henley, while reviewing medical records from the period, discovered treatment notes for a woman named Catherine Mills, who had been brought to Harrisburg General Hospital in February 1863, suffering from severe malnutrition and what physicians had described as nervous exhaustion of unknown origin. Catherine Mills, now residing in a charitable institution in Philadelphia, was located and interviewed by Detective Morrison on April 18th. Her account, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, provided the first direct testimony about conditions within Blackwood's basement chambers. Mills revealed that she had been a traveling actress, performing with a small theatrical company that had arrived in Harrisburg in late 1862. She had been approached by a well-dressed gentleman who claimed to represent a wealthy patron interested in commissioning private performances. The financial offer had been substantial enough to convince her to accept what was presented as a temporary engagement. She described being taken to the Blackwood residence and escorted to what she initially believed was a private theater in the basement. Only when the door was locked behind her did she realize the true nature of her situation. The basement contained multiple chambers, each housing individuals who had been similarly deceived. Mills estimated that during her time in captivity, she had encountered at least 15 other people, though the darkness and isolation made accurate counting difficult. Mills' description of the basement's layout matched perfectly with what investigators had discovered. She recalled the iron rings embedded in the walls, the chains of varying lengths, and the deliberate construction that prevented easy movement between chambers. Most disturbing was her account of the performances that Blackwood had demanded, elaborate displays of fear, desperation, and suffering that he would observe and document with apparent scientific detachment. Her escape had come during a period of unusual activity in February 1863, when Blackwood appeared to be hastily abandoning the property. In the confusion, Mills had managed to break free from her restraints and flee through an unlocked door, eventually collapsing on a nearby street where she was discovered by passers-by. Mills' testimony provided crucial confirmation of the physical evidence found in the basement and established a timeline for Blackwood's final activities. The investigation into Cornelius Blackwood's sudden departure from Harrisburg in February 1863 revealed a carefully orchestrated escape that suggested advance warning of impending discovery. Detective Morrison's examination of local records indicated that Blackwood had begun liquidating his assets and severing local connections several weeks before Catherine Mills' escape, implying that his abandonment of the basement operation was planned rather than reactive. Bank records from the First National Bank of Harrisburg showed that Blackwood had withdrawn substantial sums throughout January 1863, converting his holdings into gold and currency that would be easily transportable. The bank's president, Mr. Josiah Whitman, recalled that Blackwood had claimed to be relocating his business interests to California, taking advantage of opportunities presented by the ongoing Civil War. Property records revealed that Blackwood had transferred ownership of his 3rd Street residence to a holding company based in Philadelphia just days before his disappearance. The transaction, conducted through intermediaries, had been structured to obscure the true identity of the new owners. When investigators attempted to trace the holding company, they discovered that it existed only on paper, with no physical address or identifiable officers. The timing of Blackwood's departure coincided with increased scrutiny from local authorities regarding missing persons in the area. Police records from early 1863 showed that several families had begun pressing for more thorough investigations into the disappearances of their relatives. While these individual cases had not yet been connected to form a larger pattern, Blackwood may have recognized the growing risk to his operations. Mrs. Hartwell's testimony provided additional insight into Blackwood's final weeks in Harrisburg. She recalled that her former employer had become increasingly agitated during January 1863, spending long hours burning papers in his study fireplace and receiving frequent visits from individuals she had never seen before. These visitors, unlike the well-dressed gentleman who had previously attended basement gatherings, appeared nervous and conducted their business with obvious urgency. The last confirmed sighting of Blackwood in Harrisburg occurred on February 14, 1863, when he was observed boarding a westbound train at the Pennsylvania Railroad station. Station records indicated that he had purchased a ticket to Pittsburgh, though subsequent investigations revealed that he had disembarked at an intermediate stop and continued his journey through alternative means. Detective Morrison's attempts to trace Blackwood's movements beyond Pennsylvania met with limited success. Railroad officials in Ohio and Indiana reported possible sightings of individuals matching his description, but the chaos of wartime travel made verification impossible. The detective theorized that Blackwood had deliberately chosen to disappear during a period when population movements were common and record-keeping was disrupted by military priorities. More troubling was the discovery that Blackwood's departure had been coordinated with similar disappearances of other network members. Harold Millbrook had abandoned his Philadelphia office within days of Blackwood's departure, while Dr. Ashworth in Boston had claimed a sudden need to travel abroad for medical research. The synchronization of these departures suggested a prearranged contingency plan, activated when the network faced potential exposure. The investigation revealed that Blackwood had maintained multiple identities and financial accounts across several states. Documents found in his abandoned residence included correspondence addressed to various aliases, along with identity papers that would have allowed him to assume new personas if necessary. The sophistication of these preparations indicated that escape planning had been an integral part of his criminal enterprise from its inception. Federal authorities expanded their search to include Western territories and major cities along potential escape routes. Wanted circulars bearing Blackwood's description and known aliases were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. However, the limitations of 19th century communication and the vast expanses of unsettled territory provided numerous opportunities for a determined fugitive to disappear permanently. The Civil War's disruption of normal social patterns created additional challenges for the investigation. Military conscription, population displacement, and the general chaos of wartime made it relatively easy for individuals to assume new identities and relocate without attracting attention. Blackwood's timing suggested a calculated decision to exploit these conditions for his escape. As months passed without any confirmed sightings, investigators began to consider the possibility that Blackwood had not merely relocated his operations, but had ceased his criminal activities entirely. The network's apparent dissolution following his departure suggested that he may have served as the central organizing figure whose absence made continued collaboration impossible. However, Detective Morrison remained convinced that Blackwood's disappearance represented a temporary retreat rather than a permanent cessation of his activities. The systematic nature of his escape preparations and the care taken to preserve his financial resources suggested a man planning for eventual resumption of his work rather than permanent retirement. The search for Cornelius Blackwood expanded westward in the summer of 1891 when reports began filtering back from territories beyond the Mississippi River. Detective Morrison, working with federal marshals, had distributed detailed descriptions and known aliases to law enforcement agencies throughout the expanding frontier. The responses that gradually arrived painted a disturbing picture of activities that bore unmistakable similarities to the Harrisburg discoveries. The first significant lead came from Denver, Colorado, where Marshal William Thornton reported the discovery of an abandoned warehouse containing restraint devices and photographic equipment. The building had been rented under the name C.B. Whitmore, in 1864, just 1 year after Blackwood's disappearance from Pennsylvania, local records indicated that the tenant had conducted what he described as scientific photography sessions for approximately 2 years before vanishing without notice in 1866. Thornton's investigation revealed that the Denver operation had followed patterns remarkably similar to those documented in Harrisburg. Missing persons reports from the period showed a concentration of disappearances among traveling performers and itinerant workers. Local newspaper archives contained advertisements for photographic subjects willing to participate in artistic studies of human expression, offering compensation that would have been attractive to individuals in desperate circumstances. The warehouse's basement had been modified with the same attention to sound, dampening, and security that characterized Blackwood's Pennsylvania operation. Iron rings embedded in stone walls, chains of various lengths, and chambers designed to prevent easy navigation in darkness all matched the specifications found in the 3rd Street basement. Most significantly, investigators discovered fragments of correspondence bearing the same coded language that had characterized Blackwood's network communications. A second lead emerged from San Francisco, where police had been investigating the activities of a mysterious figure known only as Professor Blackthorne, who had operated in the city's theater district during the late 1860s. This individual had claimed to be conducting research into authentic dramatic expression and had recruited performers for what he termed intensive study sessions at a private facility outside the city. The San Francisco Police Department's files contained complaints from family members of missing performers, though these reports had received little attention at the time due to the transient nature of the theater community. However, when examined in light of the Harrisburg discoveries, the pattern of disappearances showed clear similarities to Blackwood's methods of operation. Inspector James McKenna of the San Francisco Police had investigated the Professor Blackthorne case in 1869 after discovering an abandoned facility in the hills south of the city. The building, constructed as a private residence but modified for unknown purposes, contained basement chambers equipped with restraint devices and photographic equipment. McKenna's report described finding personal effects belonging to multiple individuals, along with documentation suggesting that the facility had housed numerous people over an extended period. The most disturbing discovery in San Francisco was a collection of photographs that matched the technical quality and subject matter of images found in Blackwood's Pennsylvania documentation. The photographs showed individuals in various states of distress, captured with the same clinical precision that had characterized Blackwood's earlier work. The progression of images suggested systematic documentation of psychological and physical deterioration over time. Detective Morrison traveled to San Francisco in August 1891 to examine the evidence personally. His analysis confirmed that the photographic techniques, documentation methods, and facility modifications all bore the hallmarks of Blackwood's operation. More significantly, handwriting analysis of surviving documents showed characteristics consistent with Blackwood's known script, though the samples were too limited to provide definitive identification. The timeline of Western activities suggested that Blackwood had continued his criminal enterprise while adapting to the opportunities and challenges of frontier conditions. The relative lawlessness of newly settled territories provided greater freedom to operate without scrutiny, while the constant movement of population made it easier to acquire subjects and avoid detection. Federal marshals expanded their investigation to include other Western cities where similar patterns might have emerged. Reports from Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, described mysterious disappearances and abandoned facilities that showed potential connections to the network. However, the vast distances involved and the limited communication capabilities of the period made comprehensive investigation extremely challenging. The Western Trail revealed that Blackwood's network had not dissolved with his departure from Pennsylvania, but had instead adapted and expanded into new territories. The sophistication of the operations and the consistency of methods across multiple locations suggested that the criminal enterprise had evolved into something far more extensive and organized than initially suspected. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the basement discovery in Harrisburg represented only the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing story. The investigation reached its most disturbing phase in September 1891, when Detective Morrison received a package through the federal mail system that would forever change the understanding of Blackwood's enterprise. The parcel, postmarked from Chicago but bearing no return address, contained materials that suggested the criminal network remained active nearly 3 decades after the Harrisburg discovery. The package arrived at Morrison's office on September 15th, wrapped in brown paper and secured with twine in a manner that immediately aroused suspicion. Inside, investigators found a leather portfolio containing photographs, correspondence, and what appeared to be a detailed confession written in Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. The accompanying letter, dated simply September 1891, was addressed to those who seek understanding. The confession, spanning 47 pages of meticulous script, provided the first comprehensive account of Blackwood's activities from his own perspective. Written with the same clinical detachment that characterized his earlier documentation, the narrative revealed a mind that had never acknowledged the moral implications of his actions. Instead, Blackwood presented his work as a pioneering exploration of human psychology under extreme conditions, positioning himself as a misunderstood researcher whose methods were ahead of their time. The document detailed the evolution of his enterprise from its origins in Pennsylvania through its expansion across the Western Territories. Blackwood described a systematic approach to establishing operations in new locations, always choosing areas where population transience and limited law enforcement would minimize the risk of detection. He had perfected methods for identifying suitable subjects, acquiring necessary facilities, and maintaining the network of collaborators who facilitated his activities. Most chilling was Blackwood's matter-of-fact description of what he termed experimental protocols. He outlined procedures for psychological manipulation, physical restraint, and systematic documentation that revealed a level of organization and premeditation that exceeded even the investigators' worst assumptions. The clinical language masked activities of unspeakable cruelty, presented as scientific methodology rather than criminal behavior. The photographs accompanying the confession showed subjects from multiple locations and time periods, suggesting that Blackwood's activities had continued uninterrupted for decades. The technical quality of the images had improved significantly over time, reflecting advances in photographic equipment and Blackwood's growing expertise with the medium. Each photograph was labeled with location, date, and what Blackwood called experimental parameters. Detective Morrison's analysis of the photographic evidence revealed operations in at least 12 different cities across the United States, spanning from 1863 to what appeared to be recent months. The geographic distribution suggested a nomadic pattern, with Blackwood establishing temporary operations before moving to new locations as circumstances required. The consistency of methods across all locations confirmed that a single organizing intelligence had directed the entire enterprise. The correspondence included in the package revealed that Blackwood's network had not only survived his departure from Pennsylvania, but had expanded to include new collaborators across the country. Letters from individuals in major cities described ongoing activities using the same coded language that had characterized the original network communications. The sophistication of the organization suggested that Blackwood had successfully created a self-sustaining criminal enterprise that operated independently of his direct supervision. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that the network had evolved to include what Blackwood termed institutional partnerships. References to arrangements with hospitals, asylums, and correctional facilities suggested that the enterprise had found ways to access vulnerable populations through legitimate channels. The implications of these partnerships extended the scope of potential victims far beyond the transient performers who had been the network's original targets. The confession concluded with what Blackwood described as his final contribution to the advancement of human understanding. He claimed to have compiled comprehensive documentation of his life's work, including detailed records of every subject, every experiment, and every collaborator involved in the enterprise. This archive, he suggested, would eventually be discovered and would vindicate his methods as pioneering contributions to psychological science. The package's arrival raised immediate questions about Blackwood's current status and location. The quality of the paper and ink suggested recent composition, while the detailed knowledge of the ongoing investigation implied that Blackwood had maintained surveillance of law enforcement activities. The decision to send the materials voluntarily suggested either a desire for recognition or preparation for some final action. Federal authorities immediately launched an intensive effort to trace the package's origin and identify Blackwood's current location. The Chicago postmark led to investigations throughout that city, while handwriting experts confirmed the authenticity of the confession. However, the sophisticated methods used to obscure the package's true origin suggested that Blackwood remained several steps ahead of his pursuers. The arrival of the confession marked a turning point in the investigation, transforming it from a historical inquiry into an active pursuit of a criminal who remained at large. The investigation into Cornelius Blackwood's criminal enterprise officially concluded on December 31st, 1891, though the case file remained permanently open in the records of both Pennsylvania State Police and federal authorities. Detective Morrison's final report, submitted to his superiors and archived in the state capitol, acknowledged that despite 9 months of intensive investigation, the true scope of Blackwood's activities would likely never be fully understood. The statistical summary contained in Morrison's report painted a grim picture of the enterprise's impact. Investigators had confirmed connections to at least 47 missing persons across 12 states, though Morrison estimated that the actual number of victims could exceed 100. The geographic spread of operations, combined with the limitations of 19th century record-keeping, made comprehensive accounting impossible. The network's organizational structure had proven remarkably resilient to law enforcement pressure. Despite the arrest of several minor collaborators, including Harold Milbrook's former associates in Philadelphia, the core leadership had successfully evaded capture. Dr. Ashworth had vanished completely after fleeing Boston, while the mysterious figures associated with the Meridian Society had retreated behind legal protections that made prosecution impossible without additional evidence. Most frustrating for investigators was the realization that Blackwood's confession had been carefully crafted to reveal just enough information to demonstrate the scope of his activities while providing no actionable intelligence about current operations or locations. The document served as a form of intellectual vanity, allowing Blackwood to claim credit for his achievements while maintaining his freedom to continue his work. The Chicago lead had ultimately proven fruitless. Despite extensive investigation by federal marshals, no trace of Blackwood's presence in that city could be confirmed. The sophisticated methods used to deliver his confession suggested access to resources and assistance that implied the continued existence of his support network. Investigators concluded that the Chicago postmark had been deliberately chosen to misdirect their efforts. The case's impact extended far beyond law enforcement circles. Newspaper coverage of the discoveries had generated public awareness of the vulnerabilities that allowed such enterprises to operate undetected. The revelation that respected members of society had participated in or facilitated Blackwood's activities prompted broader questions about the moral foundations of civilized society. Medical and academic communities struggled to reconcile Blackwood's apparent intellectual sophistication with the depravity of his actions. The clinical precision of his documentation and the pseudo-scientific framework he had constructed to justify his activities challenged assumptions about the relationship between education and moral behavior. Several universities quietly reviewed their admission and oversight procedures in response to the revelations about Dr. Ashworth's involvement. The legal system faced similar challenges in addressing crimes that had been conducted under the guise of scientific research. Existing statutes proved inadequate for prosecuting activities that had been systematically organized and conducted over extended periods. Legislative bodies in several states began drafting new laws specifically designed to address organized criminal enterprises that exploited vulnerable populations. Perhaps most troubling was the evidence that Blackwood's network had established what appeared to be permanent institutional relationships. The references in his confession to partnerships with hospitals and asylums suggested that the criminal enterprise had evolved beyond individual operations to become integrated with legitimate institutions. Investigating these connections would require resources and authority that exceeded the capabilities of local law enforcement. The basement on 3rd Street was eventually demolished in early 1892. Though not before extensive documentation of its construction and contents. The city of Harrisburg erected a small memorial park on the site, with a simple plaque acknowledging the victims whose suffering had been discovered there. The memorial made no reference to the broader network or ongoing investigations, reflecting official reluctance to publicize the full scope of the case. Detective Morrison retired from active service in 1893, citing the psychological toll of his investigation into Blackwood's activities. His personal papers, donated to the Pennsylvania State Archives after his death in 1907, contained extensive notes about leads that had never been fully pursued and connections that remained unexplored. Morrison had remained convinced until his death that Blackwood's network continued to operate, adapting its methods to changing circumstances while maintaining its fundamental criminal purpose. The final entry in the official case file, written by Morrison's successor in December 1891, acknowledged that the investigation had raised more questions than it had answered. The discovery in Harrisburg had revealed the existence of a criminal enterprise whose sophistication and scope challenged conventional understanding of organized crime. Whether that enterprise had been permanently disrupted or had simply adapted to avoid detection remained an open question that would haunt law enforcement for decades to come. The case of Cornelius Blackwood and his network of collaborators entered the historical record as a reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty disguised as intellectual pursuit. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.